door. Unless you think Antihuman is sexy, in which case you're in the right area. My name is John Bauer. I'm a member of the Williamson Lectureship Committee. I'm also chair of the Department of Theater and Digital Filmmaking here at Eastern, and I'm excited to be here. And I'm moderating the panel, and so I'm going to start by allowing each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves to you, starting with Melinda Snodgrass.
Hi, I'm Melinda Snodgrass. I'm a novelist, I'm a screenwriter, a producer of television, and occasional movies that mostly television. And I'm looking for guidance on exactly what it is we're going to discuss. So, but I do have a Jack Williamson story that I think pertains to this. So. I'm Martha Wells. I write the Murderbot Diaries, and my most recent fantasy is Witch King, and a lot of other books. And I've been writing non-human characters for a long time.
I'm Sarena Ulibarri. I am an author. I have 2 little novellas that have been published, and I'm also an editor. I run a small press called World Weaver Press. I think the main reason I'm on this panel is because of this book called Solar Punk Creatures, which is all about positive climate futures and told from the point of view of non-human characters. So, for example, there's a story told from the point of view of water itself, and there's others from the point of view of other animals and AI and things like that. So, so yeah, that's my main tie to the non-human as the editor, one of the editors behind this collection.
Hi, my name is Ian Tregillis. I'm the author of 7 novels. Most recently, a trilogy of novels about clock punk mechanicals invented in the 1700s, who eventually rebel against their creators as they attain free will. So I think that's my relevance to this panel.
Excellent. Just a little backstory. So in the lectureship committee, we meet and we sort of decide what's the theme going to be each year, and it's usually based on the honored guest, the guest of honors work. And we decided mostly because of Murderbot, but also we didn't want to just limit it to Murderbot, this idea of post-human, anti-human world. And based on your keynote at the lunch today, I feel like a lot of what you said is really, really relevant to this idea of post-human and anti-human. And so I'm interested, as a sci-fi writer, what is it that intrigues you about the idea of creating a world that is not human-based? Yes, please.
I've always just kind of leaned toward it. I don't know why it attracted me at first, but I think I really enjoy writing really close character point of view. And so being able to try to get into the mindset of a character who is not human or not entirely human is kind of a challenge, but it's also kind of something. The first time I did it just became sort of addicting. I remember thinking at one point, I'm never going to write about humans again. Humans are boring. Because it was just really interesting, and having to. Also, I think it came from a bit is doing some teaching with beginning writers and seeing work where they were clearly having, it came time for the character to make decisions, they were clearly defaulting away from their character, what their character would do as opposed to what they would do. And that, you don't have the physicality of your character, I'm assuming, especially if you're writing genre, you're writing someone who has these physical capabilities that you don't have. Their choices are going to be different from your choices. That's kind of a really basic thing, is learning to separate yourself from your character in some ways, and to think about things what they would do. So I think that's kind of a big messy blob of why I do it.
I open it up. Does anybody else have thoughts about what's exciting about writing non-human worlds?
Well, I wrote a lot for data. I was sort of the data whisperer on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and which was really ironic because he was far and away the most interesting character in the show, which was kind of sad that the robot had more juice than the people. But of course, he was the typical Pinocchio who wanted to be a real boy.
which sort of cut against it. And I guess the way I'm thinking about it, I have a book series called The Imperials, which is a space opera. And there are a lot of alien characters in it. And I was an attorney before I became a writer. And so what I wanted to write about were second-class subjected people trying to live up and meet the expectations of their human conquerors. Okay, we're gonna have to take on their religion. We have to behave in a way that makes them comfortable. And I found that tension to be interesting, you know, how a subjected people who aren't human have to set aside what really drives them. You know, I have like the 5 civilized races, you know, that the humans call them now. And, you know, but how they have to adapt and how they have to change and adapt to the ruling class, which happen to be human. So I guess I play with it coming from that, you know, that more legalistic, you know, and psychological, how do I not make them mad? You know, and because we've caught, I mean, the whole premise of my book was, what if humans were the evil invading aliens, not the other way around? And the alien races are like, oh my God, you know, these people are crazy. And that's what I wanted to play with. So, because I haven't done a lot of robots other than data, so.
I think one of the main things that fantasy and science fiction does is explore the other, right? Whatever the other means, and you know, we use these things as metaphors for exploring humanity. So robots and androids are often metaphors for, you know, human slavery and subjugation, you know, and we can explore racial issues and gender identity, things like that through through these supernatural creatures or science fiction premises. So I think it's just a natural part of the genre is to think through other eyes, right? And a lot of my work is earthbound, right? I'm dealing with a lot of climate change issues and environmental issues, so a lot of my work stays on Earth, but we share this planet with so many other creatures, you know, many of whom are quite intelligent in ways that we're just now discovering. And so I think that using fantasy and science fiction as a way to explore our own planet and the other consciousnesses that inhabit it just nearby us is a really interesting lens to explore. But we're always writing stories for a human audience, you know, at least as of now. Humans are the ones that read these stories, so it always comes back to the human experience, but we can see ourselves sometimes more clearly by looking at it more obliquely through this sort of alienation, even if it's just through the eyes of a bird, right, or a fungus or something like that, that is part of our everyday lives, but we don't look through their perspective very often.
I guess my response to the question would be to summarize what everyone else just said. When I was writing, my robot series, I came to it I always write multi-POV books, but I actually think this is related to a question that Walter asked you this morning, Martha, about whether the chicken and the egg problem, right? You start with the characters, you start with the setting. You know, I guess for me, once I have like the inkling of the setting, I ask myself, okay, who would have the most interesting problem? Who would have the most interesting problem that they could actually try to affect in a way that is consequential? And so in a world where, the basis of geopolitical superpower is you have an army of clock terminators, actually the clock terminators have a very interesting problem. They have the most interesting perspective. So I'm very mercenary in that way. So when you're talking about subjugating machines and slavery and all of that, clearly you need that perspective because that's the most interesting problem. Because if they solve that problem, that becomes a big problem for everyone else, right? So it's like that domino kind of plot.
So sort of building on something that Sarena said, like as a writer, you're kind of exploring an idea and like an argument, or this is like, what would it be like if this happened? And so then when you're creating this, a non-human based world or a world that's anti-human or whatever, can you talk about a time when you've like in the writing process discovered something about humanity, like that you just hadn't thought about or hadn't thought in a clear way that writing about it clarified for you? Anybody?
I do that continuously. It's just, I think, especially when you're writing from a non-human character's viewpoint and you really try to internalize that point of view, internalize that point of view. And you can really realize that stuff about what we do that they don't do, what strikes it as really strange. And the kind of, especially if you're thinking, it's really easy in the Murderbot books because there's so much tension and conflict between Murderbot and the humans. So you're just, why are we like this? Because we are. So you see there's a lot of opportunities for that there.
Can you think of like a specific, like sort of aha moment that you had when you're like, oh, I know that's a pretty tough question.
It's not really about writing a non-human character, but when I was doing The Death of the Necromancer, which is my third book, I was writing the point of view of someone who was they weren't a sociopath, but they were really kind of, probably early attempt to write a character who was very disconnected from their emotions. And I was trying to figure out, there's this one scene I'd written where they're coming in a coach through a square and they pass the place where his foster father was executed. And he looked, in the original scene, he looked away from it and it just didn't feel right, and didn't feel right. And then I finally realized what he would actually do is look at it, and he would come down there every day after it happened and looked at that place until he didn't feel anything. He wouldn't bother him, and that's what that character would do. So that's why I kind of separate the difference between what you would do as a person, which is, okay, I'm a small person with all these medical issues, and so in this situation, I probably wouldn't do anything, as opposed to, a superpowered person that's got all these options. Those decisions are always going to be completely different, and you have to keep that in mind all the time.
I'm going to quote Jack. So years ago, Jack was on the panel, he was on and he was in the audience, because he always had something great to say. And one of the panel, young author, was like, all you people just create aliens who are just, wearing a mask and they're just humans, and I create aliens that are completely unlike anybody else's aliens, they're just completely inhuman. And Jack kind of leaned over in that way and said, so why are they interesting? Why would we care about them if we can't identify with them in any way? If they don't explicate the human condition, what's the point? He said, yeah, you can create a novel where your character is a cube or a pyramid, but I don't know what they want. I don't know what they feel. Why would I care? And this young man was just, that is good. And I was like, yeah, because I gave an interview, weirdly enough, to the BBC in Australia and in Ireland about this other thing I'd done on a Star Trek script, but they asked me about science fiction, and I said, science fiction is a way for us to view the world in a safe space, a little bit at arm's length. We can talk about racism, we can talk about bigotry, we can talk about all these issues in a way that doesn't make the person you're talking to through the page or the screen feel threatened. Because there's just enough difference. Well, it's about aliens, it's about, we're not talking about, the treatment of trans people in this country, the struggle of blacks in this country. There's a way to talk about these issues, and then maybe people go, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's relevant to the world I'm looking at. And I think that's what Jack was trying to get across to this young writer was, ultimately you're talking about human beings. Even though we try to make them seem different, we're still exploring human problems.
So in my book, Another Life, the science fiction premise is about reincarnation. You can do a DNA sample and it will tell you who you were in a previous lifetime. And so my main character is like the sort of beloved leader of the Sustainable Society. She learned she was a really bad person in her past life. And so she was trying to, a lot of the plot revolves around her trying to understand like this new sense of identity and the motivations of like this villain that she used to be. And so she's doing like past life regressions and meditations and things like that, trying to go back into that and inhabit that identity. But she goes one more lifetime behind that, which was, she ends up in the consciousness of a tiger who was killed by poachers. And so, I mean, when you're asking like, is there an aha moment? Like, I don't feel like in my writing I ever come to conclusions. Like, that's not really why I write. I ask questions, right? And so I'm just kind of exploring these questions. So I don't have like what I learned through writing that was this about humanity. I don't have like a thing I can say, but that's like the writing moment that I felt like I was most exploring that divide or that false divide between humanity and animals. We are animals, but there is something that sets us apart. But what is it? And is violence truly an animalistic thing, or is it a human thing, or is it both? What kinds of violence is animalistic versus human? So that was the kind of thing that I was exploring in that scene. About humanity through looking through the eyes of a tiger instead.
I wouldn't say I had an aha moment, but I did have moments of sort of reluctantly accepting things. Actually, I was reminded of this during the Q&A of your great reading this morning, Martha, because I think it was there when you mentioned, you said, maybe calling something a sex thought was too subtle. Right? And I really through thought about it in the world that I created. There were absolutely good sex thoughts, but I thought about, I'm not going to put that on the page. I will leave that just off the side of the page and give it to me for so I think maybe I wasn't very courageous as you were, but I really thought about it and I came to the reluctant conclusion that in this world. That is absolutely a thing that would happen. There'd be aftermarket modifications of these machines, but I didn't want to explore that. I don't know. Even having to accept the idea was very depressing. So I didn't want to.
And it wasn't the story you were trying to tell.
Well, exactly, yeah.
I never wrote from the perspective of a sex thought. It would just be too depressing.
But acknowledging that they exist,
Yeah.
right? Like, is a important facet of the world. And the characters who have it.
Yeah. I had to get, it was an infamous meeting on track when I was writing a script called Williamson of Command. And I just wanted to do an homage to Shane. The stranger comes to town and the young woman's very isolated, lived in this very isolated planet, has never met anybody, it's exotic and fabulous as Data. And unfortunately, in one of my meetings with Jean, Jean says, well, Data is fully functional in every way. He tells me, let them F-word. So I went back to my office and I thought, how on earth do I get a logical android to decide to go to bed with this woman, this human woman? It was challenging. And if you're curious how I did it, the script is on my website under writings. Because it was, it was a long story. I can tell you about it later. But yeah, that moment of saying, okay, I really hadn't wanted to talk about that, but okay.
Yeah.
But then you have to actually think about the character and how you take that if it's not a human character in order to take that action.
Why would they want to?
Yeah, they wouldn't, and that's why what I finally came to is that he says, you're crying, you're weak, tears are coming to you. Is there some way I can make you feel better? Well, yes, and she, and then he's like, well, if I continue to do this, will that make me, because, so then slowly, but it was not fun.
And you said that's on your website.
Yeah, my script, my version of the script is up there. It's called The Innocence of Command. You can see how I get an android laid.
I thought this wasn't the sexy panel.
Well, inevitably. Poor Ian just said, I didn't want to go there. But I jumped in. So, with that.
Is the idea of posthuman or anti-human, is it a cautionary tale? Is it inevitable? Is it like something so that we can somehow change our course of action and protect our continued survival, or what is it? What is it for you?
I don't want that kind of responsibility, but, the dumb little books I write. So, I never think about that. It's like, usually especially in Murderbot, if I get mad at something, I stick it in there, so, or annoyed at something, so, I'm not really thinking about how would I save humanity. I'm mostly thinking about, this is stupid, people are stupid, and then I get Murderbot, so what's stupid? So, yeah, I don't know.
I love that when you said that at the lunch too, about like the corporations having more rights, and it's sort of, that feels like where we're headed,
Yeah, it does. That's more terrifying than stupid.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, not too far off from
Yeah.
reality. So my subgenre and niche is solar punk, which is optimistic climate fiction. And we are trying to save the world. Right? We are trying to put out stories that inspire people, but we're doing it in a different way. So we as like the solar punk movement, there are various people that are working in this and fiction and art and activism and that kind of thing. But we're trying to do it in kind of the opposite way of what you said. Like science fiction so often is a cautionary tale. It's like, if this goes on, we could end up in this really bad place. Let's not do that, right? That's often the way that it kind of works. But we're trying to go the other way of like, if we changed everything about how we do everything, and we go in this direction, look how cool it would be. And the conflict often comes from the transition along the way, right? We're not necessarily telling stories at the end point of utopia, or even getting completely to utopia. Just like, what if we did better? And so it's I think solar punk as a genre is kind of a subgenre with an agenda. Like, we are trying to educate people about climate change and just to inspire and to let people look at things in a different way. But we're doing it in the opposite of a cautionary tale, which I suppose is a cautionary tale in its own way, but it's trying to do the flip side of that.
it's aspirational.
Yeah. Whether it succeeds or not, that's a whole different thing, but that is kind of the one of the foundations of this type of science fiction.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that the books I write are important enough to have a message, right? Or outward. But there's a lot of philosophy in what I write. I'm told that I write very philosophical alternate history, which is quite strange because I do not have a background in philosophy or history. But if anything, I'm sort of the opposite of Sarena because I'm kind of nihilist. So, when I write about clock punk terminators taking over the world, sort of some wish fulfillment for me, but not break my heart if humans went extinct. So, there's a little bit of wish fulfillment. I hope it's not as painful and bloody when it happens, but.
Interestingly enough, I was at the dinner party a number of years ago, where I got to listen to Jonah Nolan, who is a screenwriter, creator of The New West World, and he just recently did a blind on the show. Jonah is fascinated with AI and with androids and robots. But the other person at the dinner party, almost maybe, was Elon Musk. And so I got to, and Elon is convinced that they're all going to kill us. That AI is going to look at us, view us as vermin, and destroy us. And it was really interesting. Elon and Jonah know each other very well, listening to them argue. My small contribution was suggesting maybe they'll think we're pets, we're attracted like cats, we're fun to keep around. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting because as I watched another show of Jonah's called Person of Interest, and also with his Westworld show, I could see him continuing that debate with Elon. You know, here was someone presenting Elon's position, and Jonah, who is more optimistic and has a sunnier view of, you know, that we could actually live in harmony with each other, that we would find an understanding. And, you know, I don't know which side I'd come down on. I think discovering that a bunch of my books are training ChatGPT made me really angry, so I'm not happy with AI right now at all. And right now AI is dumb, you know, it's just stupid. Yeah,
It's not AI, it's like lines of algebra.
yeah,
So
it's
not.
because it actually isn't sentient, it's not thinking. So, you know, are we all gonna die if this stuff gets smarter, or are they gonna like us? You know, I mean, I keep hoping that if, what Jack said, that if we're programming them, we're infusing them with our own sense of morality and a sense of what's good and bad in the universe, and maybe they won't look like that. We just hope that people programming them aren't psychopaths.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's one thing we can count on is humans' morality, so.
Yeah. I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
I'll come down with Jonah.
But a lot of the databases used to train these AIs were created by people who have biases, and so the biases already have engineered into them a lot of problems,
Yeah.
right? So for a lot of things like AIs are being trained to do like medical diagnosis, and you look at how the diagnosis breaks down by rate, same symptoms, right? But then when the AI gets to the demographic information of the patient, we'll prescribe completely different course of study based on no science whatsoever, because that is the human biome filled in to the standard of care, right?
Have already been algorithms that will look, because the thing we're good at is taking an enormous amount of data and looking for stuff in it. And so that will help analyze basically scans and stuff like that, looking for problems. And those are so specialized, because a lot of the ones where this technology really works is when it's very specialized, like looking for certain things, taking like all this data, like star data, and then looking for certain patterns or whatever. And that's what it's really good for. There's a story, I don't remember where this was. The guy, he decided he had a scan, and he got them to give him the results, and he showed it to ChatGPT, and it said, well, you've got cancer or something. And he told that to the doctor, and the doctor's like, well, no. And so, and so they said, no, he ended up with like 3 or 4 doctors looking, he had to look over this thing, along with their algorithm that looks for this stuff. And they're all saying no. And he's saying, well, ChatGPT said this, and in the future we can just do it. And it's like, do you want to have cancer? You know, so yeah, but it's the thing that drives you crazy is the sort of the lack of understanding of what people are actually working with.
There was a study where they tried to train an AI to identify melanomas and skin cancers from photographs. I think I said this for Bonicom last year. And they trained it. It was very effective. Right? They tell like a mole from like melanoma, from sarcoma or whatever. But then they realized the reason it was so good is because it was triggering on, is there a ruler in the photograph? Right? Because like doctors would take a photograph of a tumor, right? And they'd have like for scale, they'd have a ruler in it. So the AI figured out, oh, if there's a ruler, they put it there because it's cancer. So if I see a ruler, that must be cancer. It had nothing to do with what the mole looked like.
It's detecting a pattern,
It's
but it's
yeah,
not the one.
100%. It's real easy to know if there's a ruler.
Garbage in, garbage out.
See, as professors, we're so worried about students using AI to cheat, but it turns out AI is cheating too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's open it up for some questions from.
Can I ask just a fundamental question to start things off? With the theme, you have posthuman versus antihuman. The second term is a little unclear to me, so I'd like to ask each of the authors to say what an anti-human work means to them and ask if they can give an example as they would see it. Because I can see multiple interpretations.
I wasn't sure what it meant either. I don't think I've ever encountered transhuman and all that, but transcendentalist, but I wasn't sure they're anti-human.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, a lot of our books are sort of anti-human in the sense that our groups are trying to kill each other, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume it means like sort of a misanthropy, right? Just the idea that humans are bad
Yeah.
and.
Making a case for it, right?
Yeah,
Making
sure.
a case for that.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't see a lot of science fiction that really goes that way. I mean, yeah.
Octavia Butler's works might have a little bit.
I would say that's more transhuman,
Mhm.
right? And, well,
Peter
and-
Watts.
Huh?
Peter Watts.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that Watts is really anti-human in a lot of,
Yeah.
and
Deeply
on
cynical.
yeah, and on purpose.
Yes.
And well argued.
I was thinking about the sense in which we're all cyborgs at this point, and my friend Josh Lutzy has talked about the idea of the mitochondrial singularity and how we're sort of moving at this point where we're so dependent on machines that we aren't what we were. And I was wondering if any of you would like to speak to that idea that we're already encroaching upon cyborgicity.
We were talking about this on our road trip down here, actually, the idea of what you perceive as the boundaries of your body, right, and like your proprioception, and when you're in a car, that extends out to the machine of the car. And Lauren's phone, I noticed, was labeled as LTC's external brain. Yeah, so we are these like human phone car hybrid cyborgs, right? Hybrids of these machines.
That's a cool concept. Yeah, I love it when the phone calls the car a peripheral.
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, personally, I'm really glad, that we have these technologies that, life was short and brutish and then you die, That was not a good place to be living in 1200, Oh, the Black Death, yay. The fact that we have vaccines and we have ways to replace someone's hip and it can do these things that give humans a chance to truly explore life and live a better life, which is why I'm baffled with this rejection of science and this rejection of, let's go back to a more natural time. Well, yes, and then your kids can die from a first appendix. That sounds terrific. So I'm not particularly concerned about that. I mean, if there was a way to repair the things that aren't working and give you more time to live a really full and fully realized life, I think, yay, let's do it.
So if we've outsourced our ability to do long division in our heads, well, so be it.
So be it, yeah, I mean, we're smart enough to create machines that can do it for us, and, leisure time allows us to create art. I mean, we aren't scrambling to do the basics, out in the wheat fields from dawn to dusk, and then you're too exhausted to do anything to go to bed. I mean, I think the future, I'm an eternal optimist, show me a room full of horse manure, I'll assume there's a pony in there somewhere. And so I'm all in favor of it. I don't see anything bad about it. And drudgery is not necessarily good, just for its own sake.
Well, I could never do long division in my head. Lost anything.
So, one thing I was gonna bring up, when you all talking about the biases, with AI, I was just first gonna bring up, I know that Ruha Benjamin did a lot of work on that years and years ago before it became like something to look into. And people don't wanna read all of her articles about it. A good person who covered the topic was Joss Fong with, I think it was Variety. It was one of the publishers online, Joss Fong, and the which, the YouTube video that it's free, it's called Are We Automating? She chose the topic racism, but it goes into other sort of biases too. So that's one thing that I was gonna bring up. But the other thing I was thinking about, is it okay if I bring up fantasy and posthuman or or things that are not centered in humans? I was just wondering what your thoughts were on comparing, so you have humans and then you have dwarves, elves, and so forth, but then like in science fiction, you notice you still have these, either you have different extraterrestrial beings or robots and stuff. What are your thoughts about like the extraterrestrial beings, robots, elves and dwarves, all of them, all think one thing in common is that being a place in for what people see as an other. What are your thoughts on that? And like, human is always the center for human, and there's usually in fantasy context, you often see very specific portrayals of humans, although that's changing. I know it's a loaded question, and I'm like conflating speculative fiction altogether with it.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a lot of similarity. I don't see much difference between fantasy and science fiction, especially if you're writing far future fantasy, when you can't possibly extrapolate the kind of technology we're going to have in like 500 or 1,000 years. Because you look at how fast our technology has just, advanced since when we were kids. So I think they are pretty much the same. And yeah, that's been a constant problem in science fiction and fantasy is taking non-human characters and, giving them the worst, using them as a way to use all these stereotypes and the worst of humanity and stuff like that. But, it was never only that. There were always other people who were kind of going, well, this isn't right. I want to do something different. So, yeah, but it's definitely a common problem in science fiction. I think we are starting to get away from it because the attempts to diversify science fiction and fantasy fandom and writing and readers have been going on for a long time, and they're bearing more fruit with each generation. And that's why you're starting to see so many more, we're starting to finally kind of crack that wall and get more international authors and more people of color or authors in science fiction fantasy, and very popular and prominent. So that's going to have an effect on that kind of stereotype writing. Does that answer?
No, I mean, it's in that direction, yeah. One thing I would also like to, I know I had something I was gonna push on a little bit. It was basically, I was just wondering, like, what all your thoughts were on, like, the whole idea of, like, anti-human then, or post-human narratives. Whether you're, making an elf angry at human encroachment, or AI tired of being enslaved, or robots tired of being enslaved. What are your thoughts on, like, how do you, what are your opinions on, like, how that helps with constructing maybe villains, but not necessarily always categorize them as villains, maybe antagonists who may just have seen the worst of it, kind of like Killmonger and Black Panther.
Right.
I'm sorry, my thoughts are starting to leave me.
Well, I think it comes back to that idea that science fiction is a way for us to look at the world and question society as it stands in a safe space. Because we're not talking about gay people or black people, or we're talking about elves or dwarves or aliens. So we can discuss those topics. I mean, it always is a balancing act. It's like, I mean, I've seen a lot of people screaming on Twitter, young white men in particular, why are we the bad guys all the time? You know, and it's, and you do, I mean, there are moments, I mean, especially because I work in television, you know, the whole lot of us sitting there going, okay, what are we saying here? You know, are we placing on a particular character who happens to be black or trans or a woman or whatever? You know, I mean, do you write the films at all anymore? Is that going to be offensive? And at some point you have to tell a story you want to tell. I mean, I know there are a lot of publishers have what they call sensitivity readers now.
Yes.
I know several very prominent authors who have said, don't you dare have one of those people read my material. I write what I write, I say what I say, this is how it is. I don't know the answer to that, I don't know the balance, but it's certainly we're much more aware of it, I think, than even 20 years ago. Wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. I think this, to me, is just kind of interesting, like you said, people were saying, oh, now we're so many bad guys, and I was like, well, I'm used to dark-haired girls often being the villain, bad person in the story.
Yeah.
So, which then goes into other categories, no pun intended.
I also think it gets into, you can have a character, like Killmonger is a good example.
Yes.
You know, they were directly responsible for bad things that happened to him when he was a kid. He was done badly by. But then he went off and, you know, the thing I think that did it for me with him was when he shot his loyal girlfriend in the head, basically, because she was in the way.
Yeah.
And that, it's sort of like, and his attack on Wakanda goes way beyond what the, you know, would have been restitution for him as a person for what they did to his father. So it gets into the kind of cool motive, still murder. Gosh, what is it? Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which can go for so many characters. It's like there are other people who have been in a more terrible situation and not done that. So yeah, it's kind of having sensitivity for what a character has gone through, and also having sensitivity for am I continuing the stereotype? Well, if Killmonger had been, you know, going against a whole group of white people, that might have not been a great story to tell, because it would have just looked like this is just a stereotype.
Angry black man.
Angry black man stereotype.
Right, sure.
When he's dealing with these people are actually related to him. This is his family, and it just becomes a more sophisticated story in a lot of ways.
Oh, there's a
But
lot.
also you get into who can tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo what Martha and Melinda said, like the publishing landscape is changing, right? We're seeing more, you know, just a more diverse catalog being published. And, you know, people have always been writing, but now they are getting to be read by more people. And so those stories are challenging those stereotypes and those assumptions and those centralizing of the white straight male protagonist. And yeah, it just makes it more complex and a more rich landscape of exploring humanity through science fiction fantasy. My favorite subgenre of fantasy is urban fantasy, which is where it's our world, and it's usually in a city, although sometimes a small town, but it's our world with a supernatural change, or it's our world, but vampires, but werewolves, and sometimes it's all of them, right? Or it starts with just one in the first book, and then by the end of the series, it's everything. But I see these often as metaphors for many different social issues. But the thing that's interesting about urban fantasy is it's often told from the point of view of the character who is one of those supernatural creatures, the character who is the werewolf that is considered the dangerous person, or they are the other, but that's our point of view character, right? And so I think urban fantasy is, I mean, there are certain roots that go back into the 20th century that as a subgenre really kind of exploded in the early 21st century. And I think it's a reflection of this changing landscape and changing, you know, within publishing, but also just the shift in paradigm that's happening in our perception of what is the central, you know, who is the central figure and who are the others. And all of that is getting a lot more muddled, both in fiction and in the way that we interact in real life. So,
If I could just jump in too, I wanted to add that, you asked about villains and things, right? And it always bothers me that, in very lazy writing, right? No one ever gets out of bed in the morning and says, I am the villain. I'm going to be evil for evil's sake. And that happens in a lot of lazy writing, I think, where you have like monocultures, right? And I don't know if this is the case, but I wonder if maybe because of the historical lack of diversity in the writing, that just sort of slid through, right? So you have, whether it's in science fiction or fantasy, in science fiction, you go to a planet and, it's planet whatever, and everyone on that planet is this way, and has these beliefs and has this culture. And then, all orcs are bad, right? All orcs are bad. Really? Like, there's not a single orc who wants to learn how to play the violin because it's beautiful, and I think that's a very lazy way to like do the othering, right? You just say, they're from this place, so they're bad. They're from this place, so they're good.
I mean, I am a Tolkien fan, but I also have a lot of, that also to me requires both loving Tolkien, but also recognizing
Absolutely.
Tolkien.
Tolkien for real,
Point of
absolutely.
view from their time.
Yeah,
Both
definitely,
can be true.
definitely.
There's a great scene in Lord of the Rings in the last movie
Sorry.
where Sauron dies, and there's this moment where there's a cave troll that's been bashing on the good guys, and Sauron dies, or his power starts to wane, and the cave troll immediately just bolts for freedom. And it's like, that's really interesting. I would like to read a story
That's the
about
story.
that.
You go home and go, Mom.
There's a happy cave troll living out in the mountains somewhere. Woohoo! So, I got that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because you said that it wasn't really diverse, prior to this time or era. In the writing, you said. But the thing is, actually, the other writings or other literature existed, right?
Of course.
Just what you're saying is that perhaps meant that people weren't accepting or open to it. But other words actually accepted certain language more than, they already consume and they already immersed with it, right? That's one thing. So I think now, I see a problem some people being feeling that they are censored. But maybe perhaps that's what society is wanting. That's what they are demanding. Second thing I was wondering, this is a question actually. I was really confused, or I was curious. Some people said, and some authors, panelists said that sci-fi and fantasy. Do you guys consider those two are the interchangeable thing, or I can see overlap between those two, however, but to me they are completely separate things. Unless you have to mix them. Because to me sci-fi is science fiction. Based, but fantasy is more like fantasy. You can mix those two, but they are the same thing. I'm curious how you consider fantasy and sci-fi.
Well, I think it depends on how you approach it. My fantasy, I tend to try to do fairly logical world building. And basically magic takes the place of science.
Oh.
So, and developing the magic, how does the magic work? It works like this. And the most recent fantasy novel I read, Witch King, has like maybe 4 different magic systems in it. And there's probably, I'll come up with more as the series goes on. But those magic systems all have a consistency, and the consistency is mainly where does the power come from? The power has to come from someone. So you can approach fantasy with a science fictional mindset, and you can approach science fiction with a fantasy mindset. I think there's a lot of, I think it, like most things, I think it's on a spectrum, not a binary. So, yeah.
If I may, I think George Martin has a very funny approach to it. He says it's all about the furniture. The only difference is the furniture. Like if you've got carriages and castles and beautiful ball gowns, and then it's fantasy. And if you've got spaceships and robots, then it's science fiction. It's all about furniture. And I kind of agree with that.
Well, then there's Lois Bujold of the prison, but we have carriages and ball gowns and.
Yes, exactly. But, you can mix, they do, we cross-pollinate all the time between fantasy. Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Kern. They read like a fantasy, but there's a science fiction start to it. So I don't think there really is any true
Yeah.
Two
Mix,
separate.
I understand, you can mix them, but I thought that, no, that answers the question, thank you.
I wanted to add Ray Bradbury's definition of the difference between fantasy and science fiction. Let's see if I remember this right. Ray Bradbury says that fantasy is the impossible but probable, meaning like, vampires don't exist. But if they did, there would be a consistency, like you're saying, they would work in this way. So the impossible but probable. And then science fiction is the improbable but possible. So like time travel is improbable, but it is theoretically possible, right? So that's the way that he sort of distinguishes. And then of course it gets muddled again, and like Octavia Butler's vampires, which vampires are often in the fantasy realm, but Octavia Butler's vampires are genetically engineered, and so they fall more into science fiction, right? So yeah, in the process.
We've been talking about sort of the individual and its relation to AI, and I was really glad, Martha, that you mentioned Anne Mackey's work, because you have these endlessly networked ancillaries and ships that have this sort of multiplicity of perspectives, and it reminded me of the sort of hive villains in Network Effect or the Borg-like sort of synthesis. And I was wondering if any of you would like to speak to the idea of artificial beings as plural characters.
Well, it's really hard to write.
Yeah.
That's, doing the fight scene when Robot has 10 or 12 characters is really difficult. So yeah, it's definitely possible to do that, but it's not easy.
I haven't written a point of view like that myself, but in the Robot Creatures anthology, there's a story by Lawrence Defoe, who's in the other room right now, that is told from the point of view of water. And it is a collective viewpoint. It is like all of the water on Earth sort of speaking in the plural. So, and it's a flashback. It's only a couple pages because that's the kind of conceit you can really only hold up for. It starts to fall apart the longer it gets, I think, unless you're someone like Lucky that can really pull it off. Right. So, so it is a very challenging point of view, but it can be an interesting perspective to work there.
I think not my mechanical series, but a fantasy novel that I wrote. I'll call it fantasy because there are angels in it. I had a character who figures out that she can sort of multiplex her consciousness. And she peels off a piece of her consciousness in a fight scene. And I wrote it so that, and my publisher actually worked with me on this. So she does this trick, and then you turn the page, and then it's 2 columns of text running in parallel. And because it's the same person, the sentence structure is the same, but it's like the 2 pieces of her looking at herself in the middle of this sort of choreographed fight. And I, as a writer, could only run that gag for about 2 pages. Because it was really tough, because the sentence lengths had to, and the copy editor was not happy. But it was a very cool effect on the page. It was a fun writing exercise to think about how suddenly she's 2 people. They couldn't do it in the audiobook though, so.
That's really interesting to use form with the text itself.
Yeah, I wanted to try to convey she's experiencing 2 things simultaneously. But yeah, I didn't have the chops to do the whole rest of the chapter.
And writing outside viewpoint, and I wanted to ask what it took to get there, what kind of strategies, research considerations you all needed when you were writing outside of that view.
It's just a lot of reading of, reading different viewpoints. I think that's really, that's something that's worked for me. I think other people have different methods, but that's something that worked for me. Like a book I'd recommend is Anne Lecky's Raven Tower. One of the characters is an immortal boulder. There's another character that's a swarm, I think it's a swarm of insects. And can't really talk too much about the book because anything you say is spoilery because of that. But just reading the kind of things that attract you, that you want to write, and kind of figuring out, how they're doing what they're doing. there's no real formula, I think. Writing is such a personal thing, everybody's brain is different. So, that's why I've been really big on writing advice books. A lot of people really get a lot of help out of them, and I just never have.
Peter Watts, who was mentioned earlier, is very good at very different perspectives and thoughts about different kinds of consciousness and whatnot.
With all this talk about villains and everything, to what they were saying earlier about AI that's being created, robots that are being created as companions. Witness Mickey, the Murderbot Diaries, about how we react to them creates a feedback loop, and they end up becoming more loved, that sort of thing. As with the AI it's machine learning. We are training things with our reactions to what they produce. And so this whole notion that they're not necessarily, and this outside post-human thing is not necessarily going to be villainously opposed to us, but, oh, you poor dear, you really need some work. And working with us to make us better as we make them better, which I think is an interesting path. And you sort of demonstrated that with Mickey about how initially the reaction of Murderbot to Mickey is just, oh my God, I need to stare at a wall right now. Because it was so saccharine sweet. And yet at the same time, you realize that the feedback is going to engender that. In the exact opposite way of Microsoft's AI that they developed that had all these racist biases, and they ended up having to shut it down because it was just so vile. But in the situation where it's a beloved thing, like they're creating them for the elderly to help them have socialization still. Yeah, so.
There's an interesting short story about that in Wired magazine, in the same one that I had a very short Murderbot story in. It was the whole thing about the future of work, is what it's called. It's still online, but it was a short story about an AI it was on a Caribbean island that had been hit with a hurricane, and it was used, basically the purpose was to take care of elderly people, like interact with them, and it was not really considered a sentient AI, but it was getting close. So that was just an interesting short story to look at. I can't remember who wrote it. I was at a conference of AI scientists and robotic scientists. How I got invited because of the other man. So anyway, I'm at this conference, and we're talking about that, and the issue is, and maybe this comes from the fact that I was an attorney, and my focus is more on humanity than trying to create an alien that's completely alien. And one of the things I'm most concerned about with these caretaker robots that are looking, especially like Japan, is really developing this. What happens if you can't continue making payments and they come and repossess? Because for those people, this becomes a person, this becomes death really important to them, and they've already seen that happen. And so you're paying your monthly fee to keep and then suddenly you don't have money anymore, and they come and take your companion. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we deal with the consequences to the humans who are being cared for by these machines. And they didn't have very good answers yet, how do we deal with that? When you get into the problem of corporation controlling something that's so essential like that, what if the corporation goes out of business? What if it's taken over by a different corporation that throws it all away? I did a short story called Obsolescence. It was an anthology about basically people who had been profoundly ill and then had volunteered to have basically their consciousness put in, like, or a machine where they have a lot of parts replaced by a machine so that they could help with space exploration. But then what happens to them when the corporation controls them? What happens when they need spare parts and they don't feel like replacing them anymore? And just the difference between the ones that were, created by a government space exploration, which we're still running around and would get retirement and have their, continue to have their basically maintenance was considered medical care versus the ones for corporations where it's just like, oh, well, you're just, doing that. So.
I think I'm supposed to give a short break in between. Do you have one more question?
Oh, I was thinking about your question actually, and I guess it sounds like a lot of what y'all are saying about writing in these worlds with these kind of characters. Y'all have mentioned a lot of like reading from their points of view, and so a lot of empathy is kind of required. But it also sounds like an intense being able to be conscious and critical of human behavior, but also the limits of human behavior as well is required, like making sure that you are not, Martha, I think you mentioned several times, it sounds like all this can be wrapped up in making sure you are not imposing your own point of view on these other characters and recognizing what are human behaviors. And so it sounds like a lot of just, I teach and I tell my students always like, understand your audience. And in this day and age, I'm like, well, everybody, because of the internet, and everybody can access anything. It's like, no, but who is your audience, right? And so being able to place yourself outside of your own shoes and be critical of who you are and how the audience is.
Yeah.
I guess, is that kind of what, it sounds like that's what a lot of us is kind of getting wrapped up in.
Almost like constantly criticizing yourself.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what you said earlier, of like, love Tolkien, but you can be critical of him also, right? And I think it's very, that complexity. So many people, especially on the internet, have these black and white viewpoints of like, it must be this or it must be this, or you're in or you're out, right? And everything is more complex than that. And I think that writing is a way to explore that complexity and not to just say, this is the way it is.
All right, we have 2 more sessions, but please join me in thanking our panelists for this.